All right, welcome back to another podcast, another episode of the Epic Meta Podcast. Today we'll be essentially reviewing, but also discussing and sharing our thoughts about the book Freakonomics. Um, George, how's it going?
Oh, it's going well. How are you? Happy 4th of
Good.
July.
Yeah. Happy Fourth as well. So, I got yesterday off, but I guess you had to work.
Yeah. So one of my jobs I had off, but the other one I get paid by the hour, so
Mm.
it didn't really.
Do you get Monday too, or no? You had to work both on Monday.
I don't even know. Both the jobs I work from home, so
You're
it's
always
so.
working.
Yeah, I'm always working, but always not working at the same time. So.
Yes. Yes, I think a lot like you have this unique experience because you've done it for a long time, but a lot of people, including me, haven't done it for a long time, and so I think the whole world slash society is kind of adjusting to that mode where you're kind of half working, half not, almost all the time. For at least, so thank God for my role, it's very easy. I just walk away from the computer, whereas most people they have things on their phone and they can start still sending emails and whatnot. So it's always kind of on and always kind of off, have in, have out kind of situation. But
Yeah, yeah. And my boss, or one of my bosses, has been uh, harassing me to take PTO because I haven't taken one day since the beginning of 2020.
mm-hmm,
But
mm-hmm,
since I work from home, it's so flexible that if I need to do something, I can just do it. I don't need to take a day off. And
yeah,
but I guess the numbers there's some sort of I don't know. They in the budget for the year it makes sense for people to actually use their PTO, but I'm not sure
mm-hmm,
exactly how that works. But for some reason, he's been getting pressure from his bosses to tell
mm,
everyone else under him to take their PTO. So
yeah. That's a good thing.
it's like,
Yeah.
fine, I'll take my PTO.
So yeah, before this podcast and talking to me, I suppose, did you ever hear about Freakonomics, the book?
Yes, the title was familiar to me. I hadn't read it, and I didn't have any familiarity with the content of the book itself, but I
Mm,
was aware that it existed.
cool. So yeah, I don't know. I'm a big fan of I mean the book itself, but moving on from that, um, as to the rest of their work, which is a podcast and like some of the other stuff and the general territory that they explore is very interesting to me. So
Hmm.
that's kind of what drew me in and kind of kept a hook on me. Even though I follow other podcasts or follow other things, Freakonomics kind of like that core. Um, you know, I don't think I'll ever not follow them. So we did for the listeners, we did due to my due to my timeline and schedule, and then I guess most more energy as well. I read only I had to reread, and I read only three of the chapters. I did read a little bit more of the epilogue as well. But for those who are following, so we're going to go into deeper discussion point on some of the chapters. We selected three. However, I just want to get your take on the whole book itself, since this is your first read through. So what do you think?
So I thought there were some interesting ideas that they discussed. There were, I'm going to be honest, there were a few times when I began to zone out a little.
Yeah,
uh,
yeah,
um,
absolutely.
and then that got me to thinking. You had asked in the last podcast, and I think this is what you were getting at, like what's my interest in free will or philosophy and that sort of thing, because I think you
Mm,
tend to zone out um,
mm,
when consuming that material. So
mm-hmm.
I got perspective on your experience through reading Freakonomics.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, So would you say that you like it or don't like it in general?
Um, as I said, there were a few ideas that I found interesting,
Mm,
but the general pace of the book and the way it was written, and um, it 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 didn't grab me.
mm.
I'll put it that way.
Okay, cool. So it's more like homework for you.
It was, yeah, yeah, it was.
Okay.
And
Yeah, that's
and
fair.
and so I listened to an audio version. I didn't read it.
Same. I re-listened to the audio version. I
Did
think the
you?
first.
I'm sorry for cutting you off, but did you find that every so often there were these musical interludes that they would
Mm-hmm.
play,
Mm-hmm.
and it seemed like they were not. I. It wasn't logical in the places that they would insert those. I there
I
was
didn't.
there was a couple times where it seemed like they were in the middle of something, and then the music would start, and it would stop, and then so there's music to play them out, and then there's music to play them back in again, and then they would just start up again. And I was wondering, like, did they put those in when they needed to take a bathroom break during the recording session, or?
I highly doubt it. I think for something like this, it's actually, they're actually pretty sure they plan it and try to do their best they can. I didn't diagnose that as deep as you did, but I enjoyed it when it was happening. It was only very short, so it basically, if you were, when you're driving or thinking about this stuff, it gives you a break. So that's I think that's the design and the intention. Whether or not it has the effect is different. But
Yeah,
for me, it was a nice break.
two,
Uh,
two, two things on that. The
mhm.
music obviously is very neutral. It's like upbeat, neutral. I mean,
Elevator music, yeah.
yeah, kind of elevator music, but I'm assuming it's intended to sort of, I don't know, put you in the mindset that whatever they were talking about has just concluded, and now
Hmm.
you're a better person for having absorbed that information, or whatever. And
Sorry,
and
yeah.
it got me to thinking about how you inserted music into our last podcast. To like, the idea was to sort of put a capstone, or separate different topics that we were discussing. But
Hmm.
when I was listening to it, it didn't feel it seemed more of a distraction than something that would aid the
Hmm.
consumption of the information. So I don't know. There's some connection there. Like, did you listen back to our last podcast
Most of it, yeah. So
with a
when we
particular
talked,
ear to the music that you
so when I
inserted?
put the music in, I would listen when I was doing editing. When I put the music in, I would listen to essentially segments where the music was play. And so I was listening with an editing mode so that when it goes to a certain point, I wanted you to have just basically an air of ease of conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So if that would, if that effect wasn't achieved, then really, there's no point. And if you listen to a longer, well, I guess different podcasts have different styles. So I listen to Freakonomics the most, right? I do listen to other one, but typically they're only like 30 minutes, news Z kind of information.
Mm-hmm.
This book, when I first time I read it, and I don't know how you are like when, other than novels that are like movies, when I read a book that is a non-fiction, so it's just information and discussion. I have to stop because my brain is limited and I can only intake so much.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like a professor teaching a class or something. After a while, I'm already gone, and I figure out this is why classes are around 50 minutes to an hour and a half because people can't concentrate that much. Um,
Well, and that's the
so
benefit of reading an actual book as opposed to listening
right,
to it on audio, because you can zone
right.
out when you listen to it on audio. If you zone out
Hmm.
while reading, you can just put it down and then continue from where you left off.
Right, right. So yeah, a lot of time I have to rewind I guess, or re-listened with audio versions. But because I was already exposed to this, I kind of just I already got the gist of it, so I
Mhm.
can follow what they're talking about a little bit faster. Cool. I forgot to put in the agenda, and we're gonna do it now. Is something I call edits and take back, so to speak.
Mhm.
So I don't know if you remember, maybe 2, 3 episodes ago, there was one where I talk about the graffiti theory with policing. Do you remember?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't remember what episode we did that on, but that was a mistake. So for those who are who's keeping track, and if they can keep track better, that's great. Because now I don't,
Scott
as my
Markowitz.
yeah, as my own content creator, I don't remember when I put out false information, which is critical. If you're a journalist, you need to know.
Well,
And then,
what specifically are you referring to when you say
so
the graffiti? Um,
we talked about policing, and I bring up the idea that if you have heard of this thing or phenomenon back in the 90s where
mhm,
the police started painting over graffitis and it diminished crime rates.
mhm.
Um, and so that was a wrong was this wrong quoting mechanism because now reading this book, I now learned that what I thought was the truth was basically my brain rewiring and incorrectly, and we know that that's not actually accountable. Reducing
Well,
crime rate is actually
so
accountable for something else.
yeah, so
But
I think the idea was that if the police took care of minor crimes,
right,
then that would decrease the number of major crimes that were committed.
right.
And that
So,
was a major theory that they were talking about in terms of New York City when
hmm
Rudolph Giuliani was mayor. And
yep,
um, but so Freakonomics challenges that theory.
right. So I'm pretty sure. I'm like 99% sure in the previous episode, whenever that was, when I brought it up, I was referencing Freakonomics, but I was referencing it incorrectly because that's not the main theory, or supported information. So,
Yeah, I mean I
so
don't know that
that's
it.
that's my only edit to that. But
Okay, and I don't know that the case has been closed on that particular subject.
correct. Yep.
There are a lot of people who believe that policing smaller crimes will have like a trickle up tech, effect,
Effect.
um, and that may or may not be true.
Hmm.
Certainly in the '90s, the police in New York
Yep.
City used that technique, and there were there was a large drop in crime. But so Freakonomics makes the argument that that drop in crime didn't have anything to do with those
Hmm.
policing techniques, but rather had to do with something else.
Right.
And we'll get into that,
Cool.
I guess.
Yeah, so I think going forward, right after the introduction, we might implement some edits or add on to previous conversation as well, in case there's anything like that you want to recorrect
Oh,
or
sure.
correct.
Yeah, we want
Yeah.
our audience to have faith in us as listeners.
Cool. All right. So uh, maybe next episode, but do you have anything right off the top of your head that you want to add to or correct from previous recordings? Anything stood out? I know it's unplanned for you, but
Yeah, I can't think of
just
anything right off the top of my head, but if something does occur to me, I'll bring it up.
yeah. So let's share because I'm sure you have it written down than I do. The 3 chapters we're gonna cover, and then you can go directly to the first chapter and share us, your thoughts.
Okay, so the 3 chapters I picked as interesting were one is called how is the Ku Klux Klan like real estate agents?
Mm-hmm.
I don't have the full title in front of me. I just wrote down how is the Ku Klux Klan like dot dot dot.
Yep.
So that
Real
was one
estate
chapter.
agents. That was the correct one. Yep.
And the next chapter is why do drug dealers still live with their moms? And the final chapter is where have all the criminals gone? Which has to do with what we were just talking about.
Yep.
So should we start out with the Ku Klux Klan? Uh,
Mm-hmm.
okay. So the major premise of this chapter is that uh, the Ku Klux Klan was intriguing to people who were not in the Ku Klux Klan, and therefore drove membership uh, to that organization because of their secrecy.
Mm.
They had like secret handshakes and secret passwords, and their meetings were secret, and this was back in the 20s when the Ku Klux Klan was a major force, or yeah, and so this one guy who infiltrated the Klan and started releasing some of their secrets to the public, and that supposedly had the effect of making people less interested in the Ku Klux Klan, and their membership dropped off.
Yep.
And so that's related to real estate agents in that a real estate agent supposedly has specialized knowledge in the field of selling and buying houses. And that's why you want a real estate agent, so the theory goes, on your side, because you're not privy to all that information when you're selling a house.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and the book used the specific example of real estate agents when they sell their own houses versus when they sell a client's house, is they're more incentivized to hold out for a higher price on their own house
Mm.
because they get a percentage of the sales price, but when they're selling someone else's house, that percentage doesn't add up to all that much. So they wouldn't. So let's say there was an offer of $300,000 on your house. If they held out on the sale until the buyer raised their offer to $350,000, they would only realize a couple $100 worth of gain.
Right.
So they're incentivized to take the first substantial offer when they're selling a
Mm-hmm.
house for a client. Now,
Yep.
if they're selling their own house, then they make a much larger commission, obviously. So
Right.
there's more incentive to hold out for a higher price.
Yep. On average, it's 10 days longer on the market listing when they sell their own properties. Yeah. So what do you think?
So this gets into the question of, or the idea of incentives and how incentives work
Mm-hmm.
on people to get them to act a certain way.
Mm.
And they also talked about within the subject matter of incentives. They also talked about a daycare in Israel where the parents would show up late to pick up their kids.
Right.
So in order to get them to show up on time, they instituted a $3 fine for anyone who was late, and that
Mm-hmm.
had the exact opposite effect of what they intended. More people started showing up late, and they
Yeah.
theorized that they were showing up late because a $3 fine was not that. It was worth it to them to pay $3
Yep.
and have their conscience clear when they picked up their kid late.
Yeah.
So the broader subject really has to do with, how do we construct rules in our society to incentivize people to act in the way that we want them to?
Yeah.
And sometimes we construct rules that have the exact opposite effect because we haven't examined the data closely enough.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that. My take on it is everything that you said too. I want to add on that I like how some of the questions they pose and the research that they've done demystify certain things, and I like that a lot because it makes things. So, for example, when Zillow came out, it was a big, huge thing for real estate agents, and basically, it takes a lot of their specialized knowledge away, and so now as a consumer, you're you know almost as educated as any real estate agent is, and that data or that service allows you to negotiate better. And so I
Hmm.
like that a lot with some of the research they do because it brings forth certain policy and effects that we didn't see coming. And so I guess with any organization, there is secret handshake and communication, and how you work inside that market is different than how you work outside that market, right?
Yeah.
And that makes, to me, it was fascinating. And I think the first time I read it, I was just drawn in and just absorb everything almost immediately without the ability to kind of just review it at the same time. So yeah, I love this stuff. Did you
But
to you was
it's not just access to the information that matters, though,
mm,
because there's a lot of hassle involved in selling a house. There's,
sure. Yep.
it's not just okay. There's the negotiation aspect, and some people aren't really good at negotiating. I mean, I would probably put
Hmm.
myself in that category. I don't. It's very uncomfortable for me,
Hmm.
and so I want to get out of it as quickly as possible. And
Yep.
that's not a good place to be when you want to negotiate to get a higher price on your house. So,
Hmm.
in that sense, it's good to have a disinterested third party to negotiate on your behalf.
Hmm.
Because even if they're not incentivized completely to get the highest price, they're incentivized to get a reasonable price and maybe
Yep.
a little bit more than that. And so maybe they would do a better job than I would on my own. Also, there's
Yep.
like a ton of paperwork, and it it that disincentivizes me from wanting to sell my house is
Yeah.
is to go
Yeah.
through all that
Absolutely.
hassle well, the real estate agent doesn't really have anything to do with the moving, but the moving is another
Mm.
hassle too.
Yep.
So it's not just information that counts, I guess, is the point I'm trying to make.
Yeah. 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 Absolutely. It's not just information where you get exposed to an act. However, it's not just Zillow. There's another service in I think last year or 2 years now. It's called Open Door. And I think the
Mhm.
more and more in the future, you will still like so. Knowing this, I still purchased this house I'm sitting in with a real estate agent, just because some of the things you said, and also timeline as well. You just don't have the time to do some of the things. That said, I've pretty sure I did 80% of the work in regarding to picking my house and shopping for my house.
Mhm.
Whereas in the past, you would rely on the real estate agent to do a lot of that. Now, I would say the work is 50-50. Um, and depending on the state you live in, the, the like you said, the paperwork and process, that's how real estate agent kind of monopolize that process because they can do it so fast and they can do it so quickly. Whereas, a civilian, a regular person might not be as quick with that. However, there's a lot of services up and coming, including automobile buying industries, houses, just kind of take all that stuff and essentially make it a breeze for the endpoint consumer. So there's a lot of places where as a real estate agent, you have to evolve and kind of upskill yourself and
Mhm.
transform yourself and work with this new model. Otherwise, you're kind of gonna fall behind. So
And
yeah.
so one thing that Freakonomics would assist me with going forward with real estate transactions is I would be aware that my agent might not be completely incentivized to get me the best price. So, and I don't have to accept the offer that's given to me. I can hold out longer. I can
Hmm.
tell my real estate agent, no, I want to hold out for a higher price.
Yeah.
And, they would have to do that.
Yeah.
So it's good from that perspective. With, with the book, though, it seemed like that point could have been made much more quickly. it's
Yeah.
it
Yeah. Agreed.
they tended to go on and on and on and get into
Very
nitty
deep.
gritty details that just I was fighting zoning out. Like I
Yeah.
really my mind would wander.
Did
And
you? Yeah, go ahead.
well, my mind would wander, and then I would get into this debate with myself over, okay, now is it my fault that my mind is wandering, or is it the fault of the writer of the book? And
You're
and
so
and
meta.
and also and also it's interesting that my mind is wandering, and that could be a subject that
Yes.
that we could
Yeah,
talk about on this podcast. So
you're
that's
so meta on your diagnose of anything that just it's not just the first reaction. You go that extra layer of reviewing, that extra stuff, and yeah, it's very. I absolutely don't do that, especially for books. If I read something and I don't like it and that's it, I'm like, I'm gonna move on.
so
Which is, I guess,
there's no conflict in your mind that maybe I should push myself a little harder and get through this,
well,
or are you just able to cut it off completely and no, I'm not
well,
interested in this, and no, I'm going to stop.
depends, right? So in school, like let's say school, for example, in that context, if you have to pass a class, you're gonna push as much as you can, right?
Mm-hmm.
However, right after a class, you're like, at least for me, I immediately can find that okay, this is not for me. This subject's not for me, and whether or not I'm still interested, I'm just gonna glean information over time from other sources or get a different teacher. Um, or learn in a different way. And whatever the information that I want to get to or know, will either have to wait or learn it with a different method. And the reason I bring that up is I don't know if you remember this because to me it was quite traumatic. So it stuck in my memory. Was algebra. So I don't know if you I was so I moved right when I was a child from Vietnam to United States. The 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 mathematics that was taught in Vietnam is based on Chinese mathematics program, which
Mm-hmm.
is based on Russian mathematics program because they're communist countries, so they kind of borrow each other's stuff.
Mm-hmm.
That program, to my understanding, without any research, so I could be 100% wrong here, was based on the Industrial Revolution plus the space race, and so they were pushing STEM or especially mathematics really hard, and so your progress was even so. I was exposed to algebra at fifth and sixth grade. And
Mm-hmm.
then when I came here, we did move from California to Ohio. So that's, beside being, multiple states have different, and then different school have different things. I didn't get into algebra. I mean, the next few years was also algebra, like sixth, seventh, and eighth grade was, deeper sets of algebra. And then high school is all different for me. But I remember it was much easier, maybe because the education was different and
Mm-hmm.
then the flow was different. But I remember struggling really hard, and I hated algebra. But once it clicked, it's kind of like riding a bike. Once it clicked, I kind of just understood it. I didn't have to do any extra processing. And so it's the same way with anything else I learn as far as like books or things I read that I just assume that, hey, it's just one is me, kind of like you, self-diagnosing. Two, how much do I want to put energy into this to bypass or overcome that problem, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so, like, if it wasn't for this podcast, I probably would have read Will up to a certain point and then just stop. I wouldn't have finished it. No. So it seems like that's like for you as well. So I would take you and your reaction to this out of the equation because sometimes we just have to be exposed to information differently.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about
Well,
it, but I guess you do.
I'm not worried about it. I just find it
Uh,
interesting. So
yeah,
that's
yeah,
why
absolutely.
that's where my mind goes.
Why did
So
you?
just to clear things up. So you're saying that the teaching of mathematics in Vietnam is is more advanced than in the United States. Is that what you're saying? They
No,
expose you to mathematical concepts earlier.
yes, that's the point, but also learning models and receiving information, different people take it at a different rate, and
Hmm.
sometimes you need to be re-exposed to information to consume it faster. That's it. That's the point.
Okay.
So,
Now,
but yes.
if you were reading a novel just for pleasure
Hmm.
and you got maybe 200 pages in and still weren't grabbed by it,
Hmm.
are you saying you could just jettison yourself from the reading process at that point and let it
Yeah,
go? There's no like,
absolutely.
okay, so there's no lingering like, I've
I
made it this
would.
far, maybe I should finish it.
Depends. If I get to halfway, I'll probably try to finish.
Mhm.
So it depends, right? Like, let's say it's a murder mystery or a thriller. I'll
Mhm.
mostly finish it, because I want to find out what happens. But let's say if it's a lengthy novel or if it goes on, like for example, Lord of the Rings. I read the first page and I
Mhm.
had to stop because I'm just gonna watch the movies. Like this is ridiculous. It's the whole chapter talk about birthday party, and I'm like, I don't care. I don't care.
Well, you kind of have to
Yeah, but
you have
that
to
said,
give some faith to the author that they're taking you somewhere, you know.
right, absolutely. I don't dismiss that the material is interesting and that the story will evolve. However, knowing myself, I was just like, no, I never looked that up again. Same thing with so it's not the information itself. I don't have a need to finish, and I think being exposed to entertainment reading for an arm street blogs that pretty much you don't have to finish book. And, not every book is worth your time to finish. And
Hmm.
I take that to heart a lot because, if the information isn't fascinating to me, um, I'll move on. Now, going back to the question, why did you pick this chapter if, so I guess you did go through all of the chapters for this show, but if you weren't doing this show and you were getting to this point where you were phasing out or, yeah, when you were phasing out, would you have try and finish it?
Uh, so would I have finished Freakonomics on my own had this podcast not existed? Is that what
Or
you're
this
asking?
chap or the chapter we're reviewing specifically?
Um, no, I probably would not have finished it.
Mm,
Um, that said, though, I find the Ku Klux Klan and all uh, secret societies interesting.
mm,
So that's why I picked this particular chapter. I also
mm.
find criminal gangs interesting. So that's why I picked
Yeah,
the drug
the other
dealer
chapters. Yeah,
chapter and crime in general. So,
yeah, pretty cool. Any last thoughts?
well, I think that the subject of incentives is interesting and worthy of study.
Mm,
And there's interesting stuff there. My mind, I don't know, statistics and math. I'm just not. I mean, I'm okay with statistics and math, but it's not my primary source of interest. Let's
hmm.
say, and especially when they're talking about the data, and you can look at it this way and that way, and it just and maybe it was just the way they wrote the book too.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Because you liked previously, you mentioned 538, right? Or I
yeah,
forgot what the. So you like their stuff, which is I think is almost the same, not the same, but I
it's
think being
polling and yeah, statistical analysis of polling data. Um,
yeah.
and so I like their podcast.
Hmm.
And the reason why I like it, I think for the most part, is I like the personalities of the the commentary team that performs the podcast.
Yeah.
So I might even zone out during some of the more technical discussions
Okay.
of polling data.
Mm.
And frankly, I don't even know what 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 the utility is of polling. I mean,
A report and news
yeah, I
sampling,
mean, well, yeah,
but
because people are going to vote however they vote. So why do you need to take successive polls, 1 year out,
Because you're
6
curious.
months? Because you're curious, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, what can you learn from that?
Predicting who's gonna win.
But oftentimes the polls are wrong.
Yes.
So what do you? So you're collecting all this data and you're making judgments on the data, and there's no guarantee that what your judgments are reflective of reality. So
which is why I don't pay attention to that stuff, but you do.
I do.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting question. Why do I do that? Given all this, and I don't know the.
You should ask that question for their new show. So I'm not. We're not affiliate or being paid on anything, and for the as long as we can, I'm not gonna pursue that model. However, Freakonomics host is starting a new podcast where you can ask any question. There are no stupid questions, so they're gonna dig into deeper into human psychology and economics and anything they can reference to answers. So one of the hosts of Freakonomics, I think it's Stephen Dubner, and this other famous, I think, writer and also researcher and whatnot, is going to start a different podcast where you can ask anything. So you should definitely. Why am I interested in polling information without actually with knowing that the polling information is mostly wrong? But that's
there's another point to make in that area, and that is. So when you ask a question to a podcast host in the hopes that they'll answer your question on their podcast, it becomes not so much about what the question is and what the answer is, but it becomes more like, hey, they mentioned my question on their podcast and other people are listening to it, And so in some sort of indirect way, I become famous.
I suppose.
or I supply my question and I'm like, oh, it'll be cool when they answer my question on the air, and then they don't answer it at all or respond to it in any way, and then I feel dejected, like I don't matter.
Okay.
So what you're suggesting is opening a whole can of worms that I'm not sure I want to open, but.
Yeah, maybe I can ask it for you.
Okay. Well.
Yeah, not that I care about the answer, but I'm curious how they're gonna research into it, and that's their whole thing, trying to find out some of the stuff. But
do you ever listen to radio shows and where somebody calls in?
Yeah, a long time ago. Yeah.
And the host tells them to turn their radio down because there's a delay between what they're hearing through the radio and what they're hearing through the phone. And so it inevitably confuses the listener. And so they stop talking and they get, okay. But the whole point of calling into a radio show is so that you'll hear your voice over the radio. Talking
is it?
Yeah. Why would anyone call into a radio show?
To win a prize? Because I don't know what you. So I remember being in the car and my dad driving me to school and stuff like that, and listening to people calling in. Most of the time, whatever shows I was listening to is giving out tickets to a concert or something like that, or some kind of prize if you can answer the questions correctly, trivia related stuff. So I would imagine is to win the prize, but I guess for you it's more about getting fame.
Well, so the shows, like I've listened to Howard Stern for a long time. Not so much lately, but
yep.
And there's typically a portion of the show where callers call in, and it's more about the dialogue between the person who calls in and the host. And there's actually a group of people that are regular callers, and they just like to hear their own voice over the air.
Yeah, I'm sure that's
and that's the reason why I would call in, actually. Because it would be so, you hear this radio host over a period of years, and they're a celebrity and that sort of thing. And so the idea that you communicating with them in a conversation is sort of a unique experience
Yeah.
and unlikely.
Hmm.
So when you call into the show, you want to hear your voice over the air talking to the person. But if they tell you to turn your radio down, you don't get that.
Well, I
You know, it's
suppose
like
not.
it's a cruel twist of fate that the universe seems to be mocking
Well, you
in
have.
that respect.
I guess you can listen to a recording of it, but
It's not the same.
yeah,
You want to hear it live. You want to hear it because you're thinking at the same time. Everyone across the country is listening to the same show and hearing my
yep,
voice, hearing me talk to the host. And it's my 15 seconds of fame. But if
yeah,
I have
I
to turn my
suppose.
radio down, I'm denied that.
I suppose. I hear what you're saying. I completely understand and agree, but it's like a non-issue for me, but okay.
I mean, yeah, it's not like the most important issue in my life,
Yeah.
but it is something that I've taken note of.
Let's move on to the next chapter you have on the list that you well, I guess we can talk both of the chapters connect because they are connected in regards to the crime world. So
Yeah,
let's
there's two different issues though. So
hmm
the chapter, why do drug dealers still live with their moms?
uh
Uh, so they talked a lot about the crack epidemic in the 90s,
hmm
and that so crack was a very profitable drug to sell at the time,
hmm
and so there was a lot of money going into that nefarious industry. So the question is, if it's so profitable, why do the people who sell it not have enough money to go out and live on their own?
mm,
And the answer had to do with the structure of the organization selling the crack. So there were some high level people that I think they referred to as the board of directors
hmm
that made something on the order of $500,000 a year, and then there was like a middle level people
right.
like that sort of were managing the day to day
Mm.
sales, and they made something on the order of $100,000 a year, and then there were these foot soldiers. I, that might not be what they were called, but it was something like that.
Nope, that was it. Foot soldiers.
Foot soldiers that actually peddled the drugs, and they made something like $3 an hour.
Yep.
And then there were other people lower than them
Yep.
that were hired for very like on a contract basis, I guess, and they made even less. So the
Yep.
question is, you know, there's a lot of risk involved with selling drugs. You could go to jail and well, that's the
Die.
biggest risk. You could die. Yeah, right. Yeah, there's violence involved too. So why would you
Right.
risk all that for such little reward? And so the answer again had to do with incentives. The lower level people wanted to move up the ranks into the higher level positions. So they saw
Mm.
taking on these low paying jobs as opportunity,
Hmm.
however slim, to for that to happen. Whereas, if they tried to get a legitimate job, they were uneducated
Yep.
and all that. So their chances of getting legitimate jobs were very slim.
Hmm.
So
Yep.
okay, so what was the so so why do they live with their moms? Because they're not making enough money,
Yep.
basically. But their
Yep.
incentive, there's an incentive to stay in that job because there's a possibility that they might move up the ranks.
Yep. Much like a normal, well, much like anything is a corporate structure, so it's turns out the criminal world is just like that. So this the
Mhm.
very few makes a lot of money and the rest make nothing. So that's why they couldn't leave or move out, of their current situation. But
So there
yeah.
must be something to that structure in that it keeps repeating itself in various industries, um,
Have
right?
you ever seen the TV show The Wire?
I've seen it. It did not capture my attention, and I didn't get into it. I've seen a
So
few episodes. So.
The Wire originally aired on HBO, and I think at the time I didn't have access to it. And it's actually a 90s show. Very, you know, very good show. Not designed for binge watching because I came by it way after. I think a few years ago, maybe 3 years ago. Saw it on Amazon Prime, and then just kind of consume it, and then realize, how TV shows today are different than before. But that said, watch it watch it binge style nonetheless, and yeah, it was really good, and it's almost as real as you can get to a documentary with regards to all this stuff. And yeah, it's
And there was one character on The Wire who was a drug dealer who also had a business degree, which I think, which they,
yep,
when they were discussing the crack gangs and Freakonomics, they were talking
yep,
about a specific person who also had a business degree. I
yep.
wonder if there was a connection there.
Reminds me of that guy. Yeah, that's very yeah, reminds me of that. That's why I brought it up, because immediately, the first time I read Freakonomics, I didn't see The Wire, so I couldn't really. This is my only exposure to that. Of course, I watch other movies and stuff, but you kind of have a peripheral understanding. But this, not legitimize, but demystify and show everything that's underneath. For me, it was fascinating because now I see. It's like, oh, criminal enterprise, corporate, America, literally the same thing, except we decide one is illegal versus the other, which is, among other things, for me, it leads to a certain conclusion. But I want to get your thought, because I was, yeah, and we'll talk about how I'm fascinated with legalizing certain things. But what did you find the most intriguing? Because a lot of it also went down the road of statistic and kind of data, where how
Yeah.
versus the last chapter. Where did you stand on this one?
So the most interesting part of this chapter was when they were talking about that the graduate student who went into the housing projects to
Did
interview.
research?
Yeah, to
Yep.
interview people on how it felt to be poor and black, essentially. And he had this
Yep.
list of questions, and it was like, how do you feel about being poor and black? A, good. B, not so good. And
Yeah.
so he ran into this crack gang in an abandoned housing, like a project, but it was abandoned. Like there was no electricity, but the crack gang used it as a base of operations. And he tried to ask them the questions, and they essentially held him captive for a day. But then they started to trust him, and so
Yeah.
I thought that story was interesting. That,
Yeah.
On the human level, I guess, and criminal gangs are interesting to me as well. So the
Yeah.
whole thing was interesting.
Yeah. That's good.
But
At
then
least you.
they started drilling down on the statistics, and it's like
I guess how you feel about law doesn't apply to statistic. Like for me, both subject is like that. So I don't consume the information on that level, but I do consume the result. So obviously, Audible is much easier, and same thing. Like if you were in a lecture hall,
no, the
I'm
results are interesting too. So I kept
Yeah.
finding myself being like, all right, just get to the point.
If you were in a lecture hall, do you remember how you felt versus, or I guess how you might feel now if you were kind of in a lecture discussion kind of mode with this kind of information? Would it be better for you versus, book format?
I mean, there were plenty of lectures where I was fighting to stay awake.
Yeah,
And I hate that
absolutely.
feeling. I hate that feeling where I'm nodding off and,
Yeah.
if I'm driving or in a lecture.
Mm.
So what was the question?
The question is, the human story captured you, but I guess you made it through much faster than the last chapter, or captivate you further than the last chapter.
Yeah, I don't know. It's tough for me to recall. What was the last chapter?
How the KKK is similar to real estate
Oh,
agents.
no, I mean, that's interesting too, because a person infiltrating a secret society. I find that interesting.
Yeah.
And I was in a fraternity in college. I love the whole secret ritual stuff. I love that. It'd be cool to be I always kind of wanted to be a Mason for that purpose, but never took any steps to make that happen. And I don't think the Catholic Church, not that I care, but I don't think the Catholic Church likes its congregants to be Masons. I think the Masons there's an anti-Catholic strain in there.
Yeah. But yeah, I find now that I reread or re-expose myself to this chapter, I kind of forgot all about it, and then I actually looked up that researcher, and he's on Twitter, the one that visited the gangs and interviewed them to depth. So
he had an Indian name, right?
Yes, he's
Venkatesh, I believe.
Yeah, correct. He's an Indian guy, and I don't know if you read the epilogue, so I didn't read the preface and the introduction, but I read the epilogue, and he was the one that brought the essentially bookkeeping or accounting information to one of the book writers, and that's how they worked on a paper and became a subject in this book. But that's how it was born.
I heard that, and I listened to the whole thing because I need to. I don't have your ability to not listen to something that doesn't interest me if I've committed to listening to it. But I'll listen to it and be sort of resentful. But that was another interesting tidbit too, that the criminal gang kept notebooks of financial data. Yeah.
Just this one though. Just this one. Not every other gangs. So, but yeah, that was because that guy. Which I'm curious.
They must keep track of that on some level in order for the organization to be profitable, right?
Right. I would say the most successful gangs are the ones that do that, right? So the more, I don't know if you ever expose yourself to other cinema like Hong Kong or Chinese cinema or anything like that, but if you, well, maybe you just know from, comparing gangs in America or gangs anywhere to any other gangs. If you were watching any, Asian cinema, the Japanese gangs, and then the Hong Kong gangs are the triads, and the Yakuza are run. And if you ever see their appearance, they look 100% as much as possible legit businessmen. And this is why they're successful, because they run it like a business operation, right? So it only makes sense to me. What did you think it was like a crazy phenomenon, or what was your take on it?
Well, because you think of crack dealers as
disorganized
or
amateur,
uneducated, that sort of thing. But really, I mean, if they're going to be profitable, they need to keep track of how much
cost.
What they're spending on product and how much they're selling it for, and then there's the whole element of avoiding law enforcement as well.
Yeah.
So it has to be sophisticated on some level.
Yeah.
Even though from the outside it might not appear that way.
Correct. Yeah. It's just like, that's why I kept remembering The Wire, because now that I've been watching that show, at one point they had like I guess a trade union agreement, for lack of a better term, and basically all the leaders, all the gang just agreed to a set price, because then everybody can make money. And I was like, oh my God, that is amazing. That's exactly what corporations do, as a monopoly or agreeing to each other's stuff. And it's the same problem.
Yeah, that's what OPEC does.
It's the same thing, except different, different contexts or different products. But very fascinating stuff, and I loved it. I think this chapter was, for me, out of the three that I review for this episode, was the most enjoyable, because I kind of don't remember a lot of it I don't remember, what I remember from the first time reading it. So loved it for me. Pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, from a 50,000 foot perspective, it's very interesting. But there were moments sitting through the chapter that I wish they would get to the point.
Because, agree with you as well, but I think I'm a big fan of it originally because I have never been exposed to any other works that present this kind of information that way, right? And so it's very intriguing to me to kind of not study but also be exposed to concept. This is why I think I like a lot of documentaries, and I think a lot of people do that
Mm-hmm.
because it's storytelling weave into data as well.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't have to just sit there and you know the documentaries and the people writing this book, for example, already did all the hard research, the stuff I don't want to do. So they do all the work that all the legwork I'm not interested in. That that's why I like it. So pretty cool.
Should we move on to the next chapter?
Yes.
Okay. So that chapter, the next chapter is Where Have All the Criminals Gone? And I found this one to be very interesting, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So the issue was that, and we touched on this earlier, in the 90s, there was a drop in all sorts of crime, particularly in New York City, but I think nationwide. And in New York City, they attributed that to Rudolph Giuliani and his innovative police tactics that he implemented. But they determined that it actually had more to do with Roe versus Wade, which was a Supreme Court case in the 73, I believe, that made it legal for women to have abortions in the United States nationwide.
Mm.
And so the thinking was that in the 90s, that was 20 or so years after the decision legalizing abortion. And so that would have been the time that had abortions not happened, that
All these women would have children that grew up on this age. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, okay. So the idea is that if most criminals grow up in dysfunctional households, either single mothers or uneducated mothers or parents or how environments that are not conducive to raising law-abiding citizens, let's say. And I guess there's a disproportionate number of women in that situation that would be candidates for abortion, for having abortions. So all these babies were being aborted that would have grown up and have been criminals in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
And so so the fact that they did not exist in the 90s, all these potential criminals, was the reason that they attributed to the drop in crime.
Yep.
So interesting on a number of levels. One, abortion is a taboo subject. Obviously, it involves the killing of a baby, and a lot of people are against that, of course, understandably so. But so the question is, or one of the questions is that a good trade-off, I guess, to allow that to happen in order to realize a drop in crime? And that's a tough question to answer, obviously. But there's also the question of, can we even make that argument?
Mm-hmm.
Am I like a politically correct criminal for even suggesting that that's a possibility, that abortion could have a positive outcome of,
Yeah, and they
reducing crime?
addressed this in the book as well. They said regardless of all of the other associated, all the other holes it could dig or a tangent it could go off.
Mm-hmm.
The fact of the matter is, they did all the data, and it seems to, whether it's causations or correlation, they did all the thing they could do, and it's that seemed to be the story, unless we have another researcher comes out and negate it, which they cited several papers that talked about it, but it wasn't to me it wasn't overwhelming counter arguments. So yeah, way fascinating of a chapter, and of course I'm biased because I tend to agree. I haven't read the other counter arguments, but to me it makes complete sense to me. I mean, it
Yeah.
makes a lot of sense. So yeah.
I would expect Spock to have that reaction.
And I'm curious if we can do that. And I think they did. They cited not just America, but other places as well, right? Like around the world that have the same net result because of their policy. I don't remember specifically the examples, but it did occur. So it's double and triple tested elsewhere. So it's not something you can dismiss out of hand, or just because you have a reaction to it doesn't mean the data is not true.
No, of
So
course, and that speaks to the evils of PC woke culture more than what we're actually talking about. But I loved how they said everyone got angry with this
yes,
result. So like
I was
the hardcore conservative Christian types got angry because it seemed to formulate an argument in favor of abortion, maybe. And then the people who were pro-abortion also got angry. And why did they get angry? I don't remember.
I don't remember either. Because it's stigmatized or seem prejudice against minorities
Oh yeah,
and
right.
low income segment of the population.
Yeah,
So yeah,
completely different
that's a
reason, yeah.
double-edged sword, with revealing some kind of that this kind of data. Now, when the book came out, I think I was still in high school or college. I don't remember. I was exposed to the book way later. Do you remember hearing anything about it?
No,
Because you were working, but I don't remember. I guess it's in the academic realm. That's where all this, would have a rippling effect, and then of course other economists will probably chimed in on all this stuff. But I don't remember anything about it.
no. This was
Um,
the first time I've heard that argument that
yeah,
abortion was the reason for the crime drop. That and which was why this chapter was particularly interesting to me, because
yeah.
that was an interesting twist that I wasn't expecting.
Cool. I'm glad that I'm glad this book brought something for you and to you that I guess this podcast can do. And this is why I'm such a big fan of their work, because it's not it's all like, what can the information say and is it true? And they ask the craziest questions, right? And then I'm a big fan because I'm like, hey, if we want to go to a certain way with our society, this is where we need to kind of kind of understand how humans work. And without that context, you're just making policy and decisions on wrong information. So yeah, legal and society cultures, and of course how we decide on things, have to be based on information that's better than just, for lack of a term, guesstimating.
Or
That's
feelings,
not
or
correct.
like, what's taboo to talk about and what's not taboo to
Right.
talk about.
And that's why I'm the way I think. That's why I've gone to the way I think and the way I choose, versus just following certain context or education system, for lack of a better term. It's hone you. It's pushing you toward thinking of a problem a certain way. And if you want to be able to solve a problem, you gotta be able to let go of certain things, so that you can actually drill down into it deeper. And then crime is one, and other things as well. But this way of looking at stuff and how everything is interconnected makes it for a much, I don't want to say reliable, but well, I guess better results, right? If you go to policy with everything you know about, economics and only economics, and you don't care about everything else, you're going to be blind. Same thing with, attacking certain problems like, climate change from a physics perspective isn't going to solve that problem because humans is a lot of that. So you have to understand everything in context to everything else, and that's why I love their work. They take everything into consideration, and they don't care where the answer might lead them.
Yeah. No,
I love that.
I respected that aspect of it, that they
Yeah.
weren't afraid to touch on taboo topics like race and abortion. So yeah.
Yep. Cool stuff. Any final thoughts on this chapter or their work?
Um, well, like I appreciate that they exist and that they're doing the work that they do. I, I don't know that I would read their stuff for pleasure or
Yeah.
even interest. Although there were certainly interesting aspects of it, but
Mm.
it would have been better for me to read it in some condensed form, maybe.
Yeah.
Although I don't know, condensed forms leave out a lot of the personality of the ideas and the people
Yeah.
explaining it. So I don't know if I can say that with 100% certainty. I mean, I guess there is some utility to reading
That's-
or consuming something that you wouldn't normally uh, consume or read on your own because it
yeah.
pushes your comfort zone
I
and
would
that's how
say
you
there's a
grow.
lot of
So,
utility in that. But
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So good. I'm glad we did this. Definitely.
Good. Good. And
But
me being
there's a begrudging aspect to it, but I am aware of that.
yeah, me being a fan of this stuff, obviously I'm biased, but I would say, between YouTube and TED Talks, this is like other means of accessing the same kind of hemisphere of information as well.
And I
Unless
think
you're
what makes our interaction on this podcast interesting is that we come at it from different perspectives, and we have
yeah,
different
agree.
proclivities. So it's
Yeah, agree.
all that is good.
Agree. Unless you were a researcher, like a PhD or a student writing a dissertation, I can tell you, I don't. Well, I don't read any journals, any journal, any science journals or any economics journals or any psychology journals. It's just so much research. I'm just like, ugh. So I'm glad they distill information down to this kind of stuff. And as much as the roundabout way of them doing it, I think they have to do it in that context, in a novel kind of storytelling context before getting to the point, because otherwise you might dismiss their points out of hand almost immediately. So if you make the statement, crime rate reduction was achieved by legalizing Roe versus Wade, people are just gonna have is even with the book, even with that information, with all the research they do, people still have that reaction. So
Yeah,
it's a necessary thing that they had to do to get the information across. But yeah, pretty interesting stuff.
yeah. I mean, the story aspect of it was what was interesting to me,
Hmm.
and then and so then they drew a conclusion, and that was interesting. But then they spent a lot of time explaining the conclusion, and
Mm.
that's where I zoned out
Yeah,
for the most part.
yeah. I think the first time I read it, it was the right demographics, right? And then the second time I read it, I don't need, like you said, I don't need all that fluff because I could just accept it. But going appealing to the masses is what they were. I would assume they were trying to do. So they have to give all that context. So that
Yeah.
I think for someone that it's like
Okay.
you who have come across a lot of information already or consume stuff, you can just just give me the stuff. You don't need to tell me the whole thing about it.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Any conclusion thoughts or shout out?
Shout out. Well, shout out to our 7 subscribers on YouTube.
Yeah.
Two of which
think-
are you and me.
I don't even know if I subscribe to our own channel because it doesn't show, so I can't tell. But yeah, I am happy with the new subscribers, and if we can get to, I think it's a large number. It's either 100 or 1,000. We can get our own like channel name after. So like right now, if you go to our channel, it just youtube.com/ a bunch of code words. So if you go to other channels, be youtube.com/ whatever channel you're on. So that's my long-term goal. So hopefully our listeners will keep listening to us.
Yeah.
So that's awesome. Okay. Well, I think that's it. Anything else? You want to say goodbye?
I have nothing else.
Well, thank you for listening, and see you next time.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. Hey, this is Thang here with the Epic Meta podcast team. Thank you so much for listening. Did you listen to the whole episode? Did you enjoy it? Were there things that we missed? Were there topics you would like for us to dive deeper into? And of course, what other topics should we discuss in the future? If you have any of these thoughts or comments, please share with us what you think and how you feel regarding the current episode, and of course, other ideas that you might have for future episodes below. As always, thank you so much for listening, and until next time, be good and be well.